I still remember the smell of sawdust in the mornings when I'd visit Dad's shop. The sun barely up, him already there, hunched over a new piece he was working on. There was always something about those early mornings that stuck with me. The world seemed quieter, more manageable. He'd work with this fierce, focused energy that made me feel like I was watching a master in his art. His shop was more than just a place of business, it was an extension of him. And when he passed, it was like a part of the shop died with him. Taking over the business was never a question. I knew I had to do it, even if the thought filled me with equal parts dread and a sense of duty. It wasn't that I lacked the skills. Dad had always included me in the little things. The sanding, the varnishing, even the bookkeeping here and there. But I'd never imagined being the one responsible for it all, the way he had been. I'd always thought he'd be around to keep it going. After the funeral, I spent hours just sitting in the shop, surrounded by the tools he'd used for years, the smell of the varnish and wood bringing me a strange kind of comfort. I remember sitting there, running my fingers along the grains of a piece he hadn't finished yet. A set of cabinets for an order that had been put on hold indefinitely. There was no one else in the shop, just me. The silence, and the lingering presence of my dad in every corner, every tool, every unfinished project. Running his business felt like the only way I could honor him. So, I made a promise to myself that I would do just that, keep it going as he would have wanted. Even if I had no idea how to fill his shoes. The paperwork was complicated. There were documents to sign, accounts to settle, taxes, and so many things I never knew existed in the back end of a business. But I pressed on, figuring it out piece by piece. For weeks, I barely left the shop, adjusting to my new life and the overwhelming responsibility that came with it. It was just me against the unknown, but I kept telling myself I was doing it for Dad, for his legacy. In some strange way, I thought that by keeping the shop alive, I was keeping him alive too. The town had always known this as Joe's place, that's what people called it. No matter what the official name was, folks respected Dad, admired him, even relied on him. He was one of those people you didn't think could ever disappear. And here I was, trying to make sure his absence didn't swallow everything he built. It wasn't easy. I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me. But that was nothing compared to what was coming next. I was settling into a routine, getting a feel for how the business worked and what it took to keep it running. I'd even begun adding my own touch here and there. Small changes I thought my dad would appreciate, just subtle improvements to the organization of the workspace. Things that helped streamline the daily workflow. But it was hard not to feel the emptiness of the place without him around. I'd catch myself sometimes, about to ask him a question, only to remember that he wasn't there to answer it. It made me feel like a kid again, fumbling in the dark, but somehow, I pushed through, keeping everything moving. About a month in, my mom started dropping by the shop more often. I assumed she was just checking in on me, wanting to make sure I was holding up. At first, it was nice to have her around. She'd sit with me, sometimes dusting off the shelves, sometimes just keeping me company in the quiet. But over time, her visits grew more frequent, and the tone of her questions began to shift. "Are you sure you're handling all this okay?" she asked one day, leaning against the counter with a concerned look. "It's a lot for one person. I don't want you overworking yourself." I shrugged it off, telling her I could manage. Sure, it was a lot, but it was my responsibility now. I wasn't about to back down just because things were difficult. She kept coming back with little suggestions. "You know, if you ever need help, maybe you could bring someone in to assist you," she said. "You know, your stepdad has some experience with this kind of work." That was the first time she'd brought him up. Mom had remarried about a year after my dad passed, and though I hadn't thought much of it at the time, I started to wonder why she was so eager to bring him into the picture now. I tried to politely deflect. "I think I'm good for now, Mom. I'd rather keep things just as Dad left them." She seemed to accept it for the moment, but there was something about the way she looked around the shop that unsettled me. It was as if she was sizing the place up, seeing it in a different light than I did. And, in a way, I felt like I was starting to lose a piece of the sanctuary my dad had left behind. Then, just a couple of weeks later, she brought him by without even asking me. I was in the back, working on a custom order, when I heard voices at the front. When I stepped out, there he was, Tom, my new stepdad, with his arm around my mom and a curious look on his face. "Hey, I was just showing Tom around," she said casually, as if this were all perfectly normal. "He's been dying to see the place." I forced a polite smile, but I could feel the tension building in my chest. I wasn't ready to have someone else intruding here, especially not someone who had nothing to do with my dad or the shop. Tom wandered around, nodding at everything and throwing out comments like, "Oh, I've seen places like this before," or, "I could really see this place taking off if you made a few updates." I could barely hold back the irritation. I felt this wasn't just any business, it was my dad's legacy. The thought of changing it felt like a betrayal. After that day, Tom started showing up more often, just like Mom had. He dropped by unannounced, talking about all the potential he saw in the shop. At first, I thought he was just trying to make conversation, maybe even offer some advice. But it became clear that he had a different vision for the business. One that didn't line up with what I had in mind. One day, he said, "You know, if you ever wanted to bring someone on to help, I've got a nephew who's great with his hands. He's been looking for a job, and I think he'd be a great fit here." I didn't know what to say. It felt like he was trying to wedge his way in. Little by little, I told him I'd think about it. But really, I had no intention of bringing in anyone from his family. This was my dad's shop, and I wasn't about to let someone else step in and change that. But the pressure didn't stop. Mom started echoing Tom's suggestions, talking about how family should help family, and how it would be a great opportunity for all of us to work together. I felt trapped, as if they were trying to box me in, using words like family to make me feel guilty for wanting to keep the business my own. I tried to explain that I wanted to handle things alone, that I needed time to figure out what I was doing without adding more people into the mix. But no matter what I said, it felt like I was being unreasonable in their eyes. They'd look at each other with these knowing glances, like they were both thinking the same thing but weren't saying it outright. Eventually, I started feeling like a stranger in my own shop. It was supposed to be a place where I felt close to my dad, where I could carry on his legacy in my own way. But now, every time I walked in, I felt a nagging sense of doubt. Was I really being selfish by not wanting to share it? Was I holding on to something I couldn't handle alone? The turning point came one evening when Tom sat me down and told me, bluntly, that it was time to think about the future. He talked about expanding operations and bringing in people who could take the business to the next level. It was clear that he had big plans for the place, plans that didn't include me being in charge. "I know it's hard to let go," he said, almost condescendingly, as if I were a child holding onto a toy I didn't understand. "But this is bigger than just you. Don't you think?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. He made it sound like I was standing in the way, like I was the one holding the business back. I couldn't believe he had the audacity to act like he knew what my dad would have wanted. I felt alone in a way I hadn't felt before. The shop was supposed to be a safe space, a connection to my dad that no one could take from me. But now, even that was slipping away. It was as if my dad's memory was being erased bit by bit, replaced with Tom's vision for a business he didn't even understand. Looking around the shop, I felt a surge of anger and sadness. This place was supposed to be my inheritance, my way of keeping my dad's spirit alive. But in my mother and stepdad's eyes, it was just a business, a means to an end. I realized then that I was going to have to fight if I wanted to keep this place the way it was meant to be. It wasn't just about the shop anymore, it was about protecting the last piece of my dad that I had left. In the weeks following that conversation with Tom, things got tense. I didn't want to make waves, I'd never been one to start a fight. And I knew my mom just wanted what was best for the family. Or so she said, but the way I saw it, every step forward Tom took was a step away from my dad's memory. And I wasn't willing to let go of that. At first, I tried to compromise. I figured if I let Tom have a little influence here and there, maybe he'd back off. I agreed to let his nephew, Dylan, help out around the shop a few days a week, thinking it might ease some of the tension. But from the moment he started, it was clear Dylan wasn't there to work, he was there to observe. To learn the ins and outs of the place like he was preparing to take it over. He'd stand around watching me, commenting on things he thought could be improved, or mentioning ideas Tom had told him about. Sometimes, he'd rearrange tools or materials without asking, making subtle changes that threw me off. It felt like an invasion, like he was trying to put his mark on my father's space. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a temporary thing, that Tom's interest in the shop would fade over time. But it didn't fade. If anything, it only intensified. Tom started spending more time at the shop than I did, bringing in his relatives under the guise of helping the business. It wasn't long before my mother started echoing his sentiments, hinting that I was too protective, too stuck in the past. She'd say things like, "Your father would want you to have support," or, "Tom's family just wants to see this place succeed. Why are you so against that?" It was strange how quickly I went from feeling at home in my own shop to feeling like an outsider. The people I trusted, the people who were supposed to have my back, were now standing on the other side, pushing me out in favor of their own ambitions. I felt betrayed, but more than that, I felt alone. Every day, I was reminded that my family was slipping away, that my dad's legacy was being twisted into something I couldn't recognize. Tom's influence was everywhere now. He started suggesting that we update the shop, modernize it to keep up with the times. He wanted to bring in new equipment, streamline operations, and expand into other markets. He spoke like he was the owner, talking about our vision and the future as if I were just a passive participant. I tried to stand my ground, explaining that the business was fine as it was, that I wanted to preserve the personal, handcrafted quality my dad had built. But every argument I made felt like another point against me, like I was being unreasonable for wanting to honor my father's memory. They made me feel like I was the one clinging to the past, resisting change out of stubbornness or fear. Then, one day, I came into the shop to find that Tom had ordered a new sign without my knowledge. It was sleek and modern, completely different from the one my dad had hand-painted all those years ago. The old sign, the one that had proudly displayed my dad's name and the family legacy, was lying on the ground, discarded like it didn't matter. When I confronted Tom, he brushed it off, saying the new sign would attract more customers, that it was just business. But to me, it wasn't just business, it was personal. That sign was a part of my dad, a piece of him that I'd held onto even when everything else felt like it was slipping away. Seeing it on the ground, forgotten and replaced, felt like a betrayal, a reminder that Tom and his family didn't care about my dad's legacy, they cared about control. My mom tried to reassure me, saying Tom had only the best intentions, that he wanted to see the business thrive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were pushing me out, that they were erasing my dad's memory piece by piece. Every day, I felt more like a stranger in my own shop, watching as Tom and his family took over, leaving me with nothing but memories and a sense of loss I couldn't escape. And yet, every time I tried to voice my concerns, I was met with resistance. My mom would look at me with that disappointed expression, the one that made me feel like I was being selfish or unreasonable. She'd remind me that Tom was just trying to help, or that family has to stick together. It was like she couldn't see what was happening, or maybe she didn't want to see it. Maybe, in her mind, she believed Tom's vision was what the shop needed to survive. But I knew better. I knew my dad had poured his heart and soul into this place, that he built it from the ground up with his own hands. He didn't do it for the money or the recognition, he did it because he loved the work, the craft, the people who walked through those doors. And now, all of that was being replaced by someone who saw the business as nothing more than an opportunity, a way to expand his influence and secure his family's future. It wasn't long before I started feeling suffocated, like I couldn't breathe in my own space. Tom's presence was everywhere, his ideas, his family, his vision for the shop. The more I tried to hold on, the harder he pushed, using my own family against me, making me feel like I was the one in the wrong. And deep down, a part of me started to believe it. I started questioning my own judgment, wondering if I was being stubborn or short-sighted. Maybe Tom was right, maybe the shop needed to change, to evolve, to survive. But every time I thought about it, I felt a pang of guilt, a sense that I was betraying my dad by letting go of what he'd worked so hard to build. I was trapped in a cycle of self-doubt and frustration, unable to see a way forward. Every day, I woke up dreading the walk to the shop, dreading the sight of Tom's family there, filling the space that should have been mine. It was as if I were watching my dad's legacy slip through my fingers, powerless to stop it. But as much as I wanted to fight back, I didn't know how. They had my mom on their side, a united front against me, and the more I resisted, the more they pushed, using guilt and family loyalty to keep me in line, to make me question everything I believed in. It was a slow erosion, a gradual chipping away at my resolve, until one day, I barely recognized the shop or myself. The place that had once been my sanctuary, my connection to my dad, was now a constant reminder of what I'd lost, of the family I could never have back. In the end, I was left with a choice: accept their vision for the shop and watch my dad's legacy fade into something unrecognizable, or fight for what I believed in, even if it meant standing alone. I didn't know if I had the strength to face them, to confront the people who were supposed to be my family. But I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. I couldn't keep letting them take pieces of my dad's memory, turning it into something he would never have wanted. And so, I made a decision. I would stand my ground, no matter what it cost me, because some things were worth fighting for, even if it meant facing the people you loved. The days blurred together, each one more draining than the last. Tom and his family were now a constant presence at the shop, and any illusion of it being my own space had long since vanished. It was almost laughable how quickly they'd taken over. What had once been a small family business with a personal touch was now beginning to resemble something entirely different, a business with layers of people making decisions, each step away from what my dad had built feeling like a betrayal. Tom's nephew, Dylan, was there almost every day now, practically running things when I wasn't around. He acted like he was in charge, talking to customers, suggesting products, even deciding on prices without consulting me. Whenever I tried to put my foot down, he'd shrug, saying, "Just trying to help." Uncle Tom thought this would make things easier. But it wasn't easier. Every decision they made pulled the shop further from what it was meant to be. Each improvement, just another reminder that my dad's values had been replaced by profit margins and efficiency. The care, the pride he'd put into his work, it was all slipping away, buried under this new version of family that my mother kept insisting was good for us. I began to feel like an intruder in my own life. It was as if they'd rewritten the rules and no one had told me until it was too late. Even my mom seemed like a stranger, her loyalty now entirely with Tom. She'd grown distant, and our conversations had turned cold and stilted. always circling back to how I needed to let go and embrace change. It reached a breaking point one evening when Tom called a family meeting at the shop. He and Dylan, along with some other relatives, had gathered around as if they owned the place. My mom sat beside him, nodding along as he talked about rebranding and modernizing the shop to reach a wider audience. The more he talked, the more it felt like they were tearing down everything my dad had worked for. "Listen," Tom said, his tone firm, "I know you're attached to the way things were, but we've got to think about the future. This business has potential, but it's stuck in the past. If we want to make real money, we have to adapt. Real money, that's all it ever came down to for him." My dad had never cared about that. He'd been happy to provide for his family and serve his community, never pushing for more than he needed. The shop was a reflection of his principles, his values, and now those things were being stripped away piece by piece. I spoke up, telling him that I didn't want to change the shop, that I wanted to keep it the way my dad had intended. But my words fell on deaf ears. They looked at me like I was a stubborn child, clinging to a dream that had no place in the real world. My mom turned to me, her expression a mix of pity and frustration. "You can't hold on to the past forever," she said quietly. "This isn't just about you. It's about all of us. Don't you see that Tom is trying to help?" Her words stung, the way she so easily dismissed my concerns, the way she placed her loyalty with Tom instead of with me. I felt a deep sense of betrayal, like I was losing her all over again. The meeting ended with them outlining plans for a full remodel of the shop, complete with new branding and a redesigned layout that had nothing in common with the place my dad had built. They talked as if I weren't even there, as if my voice no longer mattered. And maybe, in their eyes, it didn't. Afterward, I sat alone in the shop, staring at the walls that had once felt so familiar and comforting. Now they felt foreign, like I was sitting in a stranger's space. The tools, the benches, the shelves, all of it felt like it was slipping away, replaced by Tom's vision of what a business should be. I felt powerless, like I was watching my dad's legacy disappear right in front of me, unable to do anything to stop it. I spent the next few days trying to hold on, but it was like swimming against a riptide. No matter how hard I fought, Tom and his family kept pushing, changing things, making decisions without consulting me. They'd effectively taken over, and it was becoming clear that they had no intention of stepping back. In a moment of desperation, I confided in a family friend, someone who'd known my dad for years and understood the importance of the shop. He listened quietly as I explained what was happening, the frustration and helplessness I felt. When I finished, he looked at me, his expression a mix of sympathy and determination. "You have rights," he said gently. "This is your inheritance, your father's legacy. If they're taking over, you have every right to push back. Don't let them convince you that you're powerless." His words were like a lifeline, a reminder that I didn't have to sit back and watch everything crumble. But the thought of standing up to my mom and Tom, of potentially tearing my family apart, filled me with dread. I didn't want to be the one to drive a wedge between us. But I also couldn't stand by and watch them destroy everything my dad had worked for. The decision weighed heavily on me, tearing at me from the inside. I knew that if I didn't act, I'd lose everything that mattered. But if I did stand up to them, I risked losing the only family I had left. In the end, I realized there was only one choice I could make. I couldn't let them erase my dad's memory, couldn't let them turn his legacy into something he would never have wanted. I had to fight, no matter what it cost me. It's strange how resolve can build slowly, like a storm gathering on the horizon. One moment, I was overwhelmed and filled with doubt, and the next, a quiet, unshakable determination had settled inside me. I knew I couldn't just sit by and let them dismantle everything my dad had built. This was more than a business, it was his legacy, a piece of him that he'd left behind. And if I lost that, I'd be losing him all over again. The first step I took was to have a serious talk with my mother. I waited until Tom and his family were out of the picture for the day. And then I sat her down in the kitchen, where the air was thick with a silence I didn't know how to break. "Mom, I need to talk to you about the shop," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me, her face unreadable. "What's on your mind?" "I can't keep going on like this," I said, trying to keep my tone steady. "The shop, it was Dad's, and it's supposed to be mine now. But ever since Tom and his family came in, it doesn't feel like mine anymore. They're changing everything, making decisions I don't agree with." She sighed, a look of weariness crossing her face. "Honey, I know it's hard, but you have to understand Tom has experience. And he wants to help. He's only doing this to make things easier for you." Easier? The word felt foreign in my mouth, like a joke I didn't find funny. "It's not easier. They're taking over, making it something it was never meant to be. They're turning it into something Dad would have hated." My mother's expression hardened. "Your father isn't here anymore," she said quietly, "and things have to change. We can't keep living in the past." I felt a pang of betrayal, a deep hurt that I hadn't expected. She was my mother, she was supposed to understand, to stand by me, but here she was, defending Tom, choosing his vision over mine. It felt like a final blow, like the last thread connecting us was snapping. I know you think this is what's best, I said, my voice thick with emotion. But it's not. You're letting them destroy Dad's legacy. And I can't just stand by and watch it happen. She looked away, her expression unreadable, and I knew then that she wouldn't change her mind. She'd made her choice, and it wasn't me. I left the house that night feeling more alone than ever. It was a bitter realization, knowing that I couldn't rely on my mother to support me. But at the same time, it strengthened my resolve. If I couldn't count on her, then I'd have to find the strength to do this on my own. The next day, I called the lawyer that the family friend had recommended. I wasn't sure what rights I had or how much power Tom had managed to seize. But I needed to know where I stood legally. The lawyer listened to my story with a sympathetic ear, his face a mask of professionalism. When I finished, he nodded, his eyes thoughtful. You have more rights than you realize, he said. As the primary inheritor, you hold the legal ownership of the business. They may be trying to push you out, but legally, you still have control. A wave of relief washed over me. I'd spent so long feeling like I was trapped, like they'd already taken everything from me. But knowing that I had a legal standing, that I wasn't completely powerless, gave me the strength I needed. Together, we worked out a plan. I'd start by officially reasserting my ownership, taking back control of the shop's finances and operations. If Tom or his family tried to interfere, I'd have the law on my side. It wouldn't be easy, my mother and Tom wouldn't take it well, but I knew I couldn't let that stop me. The first step was to get access to the shop's financial accounts, which Tom had somehow managed to keep mostly under his control. I knew he'd taken liberties, but when I saw the extent of it, I was stunned. He'd been using the shop's funds for personal expenses, things that had nothing to do with the business. It was clear he'd been treating the shop as his own personal bank, taking advantage of my naivety. I confronted him about it that evening. He tried to brush it off, claiming that he'd been investing in the business, that he'd been using the funds to improve things. But I wasn't buying it anymore. I laid out the facts, showing him the evidence I'd gathered, the misappropriations, the unauthorized withdrawals. This shop belongs to me, I said firmly, my voice steady despite the anger boiling inside me. You have no right to use its money for your own purposes. Tom's face darkened. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice low and threatening. This business was going nowhere before I stepped in. You wouldn't even know what to do with it if it weren't for me. I felt the anger rise inside me, a righteous fury that burned away the last remnants of doubt. I may not know everything, but I know this. My dad didn't work his whole life to build something just for you to exploit it. I'm taking back control, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me that this wasn't over. I'd drawn a line in the sand, and he wasn't going to let it go without a fight. Over the next few days, I took steps to regain control. I changed the locks on the shop, restricted access to the accounts, and made it clear that any decisions would go through me. It was exhausting, every step a battle, but I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I was standing up for my dad, for his legacy, and for the part of me that had been beaten down for so long. But Tom and his family didn't back down easily. They began spreading rumors, telling people that I was unstable, that I was letting my emotions cloud my judgment. My mom even joined in, telling friends and relatives that I was being unreasonable, that I was trying to destroy the family business. It was painful, hearing those words from the people who were supposed to support me. But I refused to let them break me. I knew I was doing the right thing, even if they couldn't see it. This wasn't just about money or ownership, it was about preserving something sacred. Something that went beyond profit and success. It was about honoring my dad's memory, protecting the values he'd instilled in me, and reclaiming a part of myself that I'd nearly lost. Every time I walked into the shop, I felt a renewed sense of peace. It was still a struggle, and there were days when I wanted to give up, to walk away from the pain and the anger and the constant battles. But I couldn't let them win. I couldn't let them erase my dad's memory, turn his legacy into something cheap and meaningless. In the end, it wasn't just a fight for the shop, it was a fight for everything my dad had believed in. For everything he'd taught me. And as hard as it was, as painful as it became, I knew it was a fight worth fighting. After I'd reclaimed control of the shop, I thought things might calm down. I knew Tom wouldn't be happy, and I expected some pushback from my mom, but I hoped they would eventually see that I was serious and back off. Maybe, I thought, they'd even respect my decision to honor my dad's legacy. But things didn't settle down. In fact, they only got worse. Tom had a way of showing up at the shop when I least expected it. Lurking around, always with a critical eye. He would look at everything as though he was assessing damage, like he saw the place as a sinking ship that only he could rescue. He didn't say much, but his presence was enough to make me feel uneasy, like a shadow that was always just out of sight. One evening, after a long day of handling orders and customers on my own, I sat down to go over the shop's finances. It was something I'd started doing every night, partly to keep things in order but also as a way to reassure myself that I was in control. The accounts were finally balanced. The expenses were under control. And for the first time, I felt like I was starting to get a handle on things. But as I combed through the records, I noticed something strange. There were several transactions that didn't make sense, withdrawals and transfers that I hadn't authorized. They were small at first, barely noticeable, but over time, they added up to a significant amount. My heart sank as I realized that Tom had been siphoning money from the shop, moving it into an account I didn't recognize. The anger and betrayal I felt in that moment were overwhelming. He'd been stealing from me, from my dad's business, and I hadn't even noticed. I felt like a fool, like I'd let him walk all over me without even putting up a fight. All those times he talked about improving the business, about helping me, he'd only been helping himself. I sat there in the dim light of the office, staring at the screen, trying to process what I'd just discovered. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the violation, the way he'd taken advantage of my trust and my grief to serve his own interests. He hadn't cared about the shop or my dad's legacy. All he'd cared about was what he could take. I knew I had to confront him, to make him answer for what he'd done. But the thought of facing him, of bringing this to light, filled me with a sense of dread. I knew he wouldn't take it well, and I knew my mom would likely side with him, but I couldn't let him get away with it. I owed it to my dad, to myself, to protect what was left of the life we'd built together. The next day, I went over to my mother's house, determined to confront them. I laid out everything I'd found, the transfers, the withdrawals, the money that had disappeared without a trace. My mom sat there in silence, her face pale, as I laid out the evidence. When I finished, she looked at Tom, her eyes filled with confusion and betrayal. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tom didn't even flinch. He looked at me with a cold, calculating expression, as if I were the one in the wrong. "I did what I had to do to keep the business afloat," he said, his tone defensive. "You don't know what it takes to run a business, to keep it going in tough times. You should be grateful that I stepped in when I did." Grateful. The word hit me like a slap in the face. He expected me to be grateful for his betrayal, for his theft, for all the ways he'd undermined me. I felt a surge of anger rise inside me, a rage that I could barely contain. "This business was doing fine until you came along," I said, my voice shaking. "You didn't save it, you stole from it. From me, from my dad's memory. You have no right to anything here." My mom looked between us, her face a mask of indecision. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the way she struggled to reconcile the truth with the man she'd chosen to stand by. She wanted to believe him, to believe that he'd had good intentions. But deep down, I think she knew that he'd taken advantage of her, too. In the end, she chose him. She turned to me, her voice cold and detached. "This has to stop," she said. "You're tearing this family apart over something that can't be changed. Tom made some mistakes, but he did it for us, for the family. You need to let this go." I felt a wave of grief wash over me, deeper than any I'd felt since my dad's passing. I'd always known that my mom and I had grown apart, but in that moment, I realized just how far we'd drifted. She wasn't the person I'd once looked up to, the person who had always stood by me. She'd chosen her new family over her old one, and in doing so, she'd lost me. Without another word, I walked out of the house, leaving her and Tom behind. I knew then that I couldn't rely on her, that I was truly on my own. The people I'd thought I could trust, the people who were supposed to have my back, had turned against me, and there was no going back. In the days that followed, I began taking steps to protect the business, to sever any ties that Tom and his family had to the shop. I cut off their access to the accounts, changed the locks, and made it clear that they were no longer welcome. It was a painful process, each step a reminder of the betrayal, but I knew it was the only way to keep my dad's legacy intact. I started reaching out to people in the community, letting them know that the shop was still here, still the place my dad had built. I wanted to rebuild that trust, to show them that I was committed to carrying on his work, even if it meant doing it alone. It was a slow process, but with each day, I felt a little stronger, a little more in control. There were still moments of doubt, times when I wondered if I'd made the right choice. The loneliness was hard, the feeling of being cut off from my family, from the people who were supposed to support me. But every time I felt that doubt creeping in, I reminded myself of my dad, of the values he'd instilled in me, the legacy he'd left behind. In the end, it wasn't just about the shop or the business, it was about preserving a piece of him, a piece of myself, that I couldn't let go. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be times when I'd question my decision, but I also knew that I'd made the right choice. I'd stood up for what mattered, for the legacy my dad had left me, and in doing so, I'd found a strength I hadn't known I possessed. This was my path now, my fight, and no one could take that away from me. In the days that followed my confrontation with Tom and my mom, something changed inside me. There was a new resolve, a quiet strength I hadn't felt before. I'd spent so long feeling powerless, Like I was fighting a losing battle against people who were supposed to care about me. But now, I was free of them, free to make my own choices. To protect what mattered most without fear of interference. I began rebuilding the shop. Piece by piece, restoring it to the way my dad had kept it. The sleek new sign that Tom had installed came down, replaced with my dad's original hand-painted one. It wasn't fancy or eye-catching, but it was real, a piece of him that I wanted people to see. Every time I looked at it, I felt a sense of peace, like he was there with me, guiding me through each step. The renovations Tom had pushed for were slowly undone. The shop's interior, which had been stripped of its character, returned to the cozy, welcoming place it had always been. I cleaned and organized the space, dusted off the old shelves, and brought back the small personal touches that had once made the shop feel like home. The customers, those who'd known my dad, noticed the changes right away, and I saw the relief on their faces as they walked through the familiar space. As if they, too, had feared it might be gone forever. Reclaiming the shop was like reclaiming a part of myself that I'd lost. A part that I'd almost let slip away. It was hard work, exhausting and overwhelming at times. But with each passing day, I felt more in control, more at peace. I was finally standing on my own, and for the first time, I felt like I was doing right by my dad, honoring the memory he'd left behind. Of course, there were still challenges. The financial strain was real, and there were days when I worried about making ends meet, about whether I could keep the shop afloat without the help Tom had offered. But every time those doubts crept in, I reminded myself that I was capable, that I had the skills and the determination to keep going. My dad had taught me to be strong, to believe in myself, and I was finally putting those lessons to use. As word spread through the community about what had happened, people began showing their support in unexpected ways. Old friends of my dad's came by, offering help and advice, sharing memories and stories that reminded me of why this shop mattered so much. They told me about the times my dad had gone out of his way to help them. The kindness he'd shown to everyone who walked through his doors. It was a reminder that this shop wasn't just a business, it was a place where people felt valued. Where they knew they could find honesty and integrity. Little by little, business started to pick up. Customers returned, some bringing their friends and family, others just stopping by to say hello, to see how I was doing. They didn't just come for the products, they came because they saw the shop as a part of the community. A part of my dad's legacy that they wanted to protect just as much as I did. One evening, after a long day at the shop, I sat down in the office, looking around at the place I'd fought so hard to keep. The walls were lined with tools and shelves, the scent of wood and varnish filling the air, just as it had when my dad was here. I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing I'd done the right thing. There were still moments of sadness, of course. Losing my mom, or the version of her I'd always known, was a pain I carried with me, a reminder of the sacrifices I'd made to stand up for what mattered. There were days when I missed her, when I wished things could have been different, that she could have seen the shop the way I did, the way my dad had. But I knew that I'd made my choice, and I had to live with it, to find peace in the decision I'd made. Over time, I found myself healing, letting go of the anger and the hurt, focusing instead on what I could build for the future. I poured my heart into the shop, into each project, each piece that I worked on, knowing that my dad would have been proud. I wanted to honor his legacy, not just by keeping the business alive, but by living the values he taught me: integrity, kindness, a commitment to the people who relied on us. As the months went by, the shop became something more than just a business. It became a place where people gathered, where stories were shared, and where my dad's spirit lived on in the work I did every day. I knew I still had a long way to go, that there would be challenges ahead, but I felt a quiet confidence that I hadn't felt before. This shop was mine now, in every way that mattered. It wasn't just a reminder of the past, it was a foundation for the future. A place where I could build my own legacy, just as my dad had. And as I looked around, I knew that he would have been proud, that he would have understood the sacrifices I'd made to keep his memory alive. In the end, standing up for the shop wasn't just about preserving his legacy, it was about finding my own strength, my own voice. It was about learning that sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves, the ones that force us to let go of the people we thought we could trust, to stand alone if we have to. It was a painful lesson, but one that had shaped me, that had shown me who I was and what I was capable of. And as I locked up the shop that night, the sign with my dad's name proudly hanging above the door, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet certainty that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The road ahead might be difficult, but I knew I had the strength to face it, to keep going, to build something that would last. For my dad, for myself, for the future. In the months that followed, the shop began to feel more and more like my own. It was still my dad's legacy, but now it held pieces of me, too, my choices, my vision, and the quiet strength I'd gained through everything I'd faced. There was something incredibly satisfying about walking through the doors each morning, knowing that I'd earned the right to be there, that I'd fought for this place and for myself. I was rebuilding, but this time it wasn't just about keeping the shop alive. I was building a future, shaping it in a way that honored my dad while giving me room to grow. I poured my heart into each project, each detail, knowing that every piece I created was a reflection of what he taught me. And slowly, I began to feel a new sense of purpose, a confidence that went beyond the shop, something rooted deep within me. It wasn't easy. There were still days when I missed my mom, when I thought about the life we'd had before Tom entered the picture, before everything had changed, but I'd come to realize that some things, some people, couldn't be held onto, and that was okay. I'd learned that sometimes, standing alone was the only way to stay true to yourself, even if it meant letting go of the people you'd once relied on. The community noticed the changes in the shop, and they noticed the changes in me, too. Customers started coming back in greater numbers, word spreading that the shop was back to its roots. They'd mentioned my dad in passing, sharing stories of how he'd gone out of his way to help them, how he'd always put people first. It was a reminder that he was still here, a part of everything I did, woven into the fabric of the shop and the community it served. And in a way, those customers became a new family for me. I found comfort in their familiar faces, in the way they'd smile when they walked through the door, knowing they'd find the same honesty and quality my dad had always upheld. They'd ask how I was doing, offering words of encouragement and support, and it reminded me that I wasn't alone after all. My dad's legacy was as much theirs as it was mine, a part of the community that had rallied around me when I needed it most. As the shop continued to grow, I started thinking about the future, about the kind of legacy I wanted to build. I knew I wanted to keep the shop small, to maintain the personal touch that my dad had valued, but I also wanted to expand in my own way, to bring in new projects that reflected my own creativity and passion. I started experimenting with different styles, new designs that gave the shop a fresh edge while staying true to its roots. It was a way of putting my own mark on the business, of building something that was uniquely mine. One evening, as I was closing up the shop, I found myself thinking about my dad, about the years we'd spent working side by side. I could almost see him there, standing by the workbench, his hands covered in sawdust, a quiet smile on his face. I knew he'd be proud, not just of what I'd done with the shop, but of the journey I'd taken, the lessons I'd learned. I'd started out feeling lost, overwhelmed by grief and doubt, unsure of my own strength. But through every challenge, every betrayal, I'd found a part of myself I hadn't known was there. I'd learned that I could stand up for myself, that I could protect what mattered, even when the odds were against me. I'd faced the people who tried to tear me down, and I'd come out stronger, more sure of who I was and what I stood for. As I locked up the shop that night, I felt a sense of peace settle over me, a quiet certainty that I'd found my place. The shop wasn't just a business anymore, it was a part of me, a reflection of everything I'd learned and everything I'd overcome. It was a reminder that I could face anything, that I had the strength to keep going, no matter what life threw at me. I knew there would be more challenges ahead, that there would be times when I'd question myself, when I'd feel the weight of the responsibility I'd taken on, but I also knew that I had the resilience to face those challenges, to keep building something that mattered, something that honored my dad and the values he'd instilled in me. And as I walked away from the shop that night, under the glow of the sign that bore my dad's name, I felt a sense of freedom, a newfound independence that went beyond the walls of the business. I'd reclaimed my life, my voice, and my future. I'd found the courage to stand up for what mattered, to protect the legacy that my dad had left behind, and to build one of my own. This was my journey, my story, and I knew that wherever it led me, I had the strength to keep going, to honor my past while embracing my future. And in that moment, I felt a quiet joy, a peace that came from knowing that I was exactly where I was meant to be, standing strong, independent, and ready to face whatever lay ahead.